The 2026 Formula One season has just started, and the paddock is already exploding. George Russell just delivered a dominant pole position in Australia. Mercedes locked the entire front row of the grid, and the gap to the rest of the field was almost 0.8 of a second. In modern Formula One, that kind of advantage almost never happens. But the real shock came after qualifying. Because when rival teams started analyzing the data from Russell's lap, they noticed something strange in the Mercedes power delivery. Acceleration that looked different from every other car. Hybrid deployment that seemed to last longer down the straights. And a speed trace that raised serious questions inside rival garages. Now several teams are furious, pushing the FIA to take a deeper look at the Mercedes power unit after what happened in Melbourne. Because if the data reveals something unusual inside that hybrid system, the first race weekend of the 2026 season could already be turning into one of the biggest technical investigations in Formula One. The tension did not begin when George Russell crossed the finish line for pole position. It actually started hours earlier, during the practice sessions on Friday. Because long before qualifying began, engineers across the paddock were already noticing something unusual about the Mercedes. Every time the teams ran race simulations, the same car kept appearing at the top of the timing screens. The Mercedes. George Russell's long-run pace immediately caught the attention of rival engineers. Some internal comparisons suggested his average lap time during race simulations was nearly half a second faster than several competitors. In Formula One terms, that is a huge difference. Normally, teams expect long-run simulations to be separated by only a few tenths. Anything larger usually means different fuel loads or different tire strategies. So at first, most teams believed Mercedes might simply be running lighter fuel or experimenting with different setups. But when qualifying arrived, that theory started to collapse. Because the same advantage appeared again. Russell looked comfortable from the very beginning of the session. The car remained stable through the high-speed corners. The rear stayed planted under braking. And when the Mercedes exited the slower corners, something interesting happened. The acceleration looked stronger than the rest of the grid. At first it was subtle. Just a few extra kilometers per hour halfway down the straight. But when engineers began overlaying the GPS traces from Russell's lap with the data from other cars, the difference became clearer. The Mercedes did not just accelerate quickly. It kept accelerating longer. Normally, hybrid deployment in Formula One fades slightly toward the end of long straights. The electrical energy stored in the battery begins to run out. Drivers still gain speed, but the boost gradually weakens before the braking zone. But the Mercedes traces suggested something different. The electrical deployment appeared extremely consistent. The power seemed to stay strong almost all the way to the braking point. And that kind of behavior immediately raises questions inside rival garages. Because the 2026 regulations place enormous importance on hybrid efficiency. Electrical deployment now represents a much larger portion of total power than in previous generations. Drivers receive bursts of electric power when exiting corners. That power comes from energy harvested during braking earlier in the lap. If a team can harvest more energy than its rivals, it can deploy more power later. But harvesting energy is limited by physics. There are only a few heavy braking zones around Albert Park, which means the total electrical energy available during a lap should be relatively similar for every team. And yet the Mercedes appeared to have more deployment available. That observation quickly became the main topic of conversation inside several rival garages. Ferrari engineers began comparing acceleration traces corner by corner. Red Bull started studying the GPS overlays from qualifying. And even midfield teams began analyzing how the Mercedes maintained speed along the straights. Because if the advantage comes from the power unit, it could completely change the competitive balance of the championship. Charles Leclerc openly admitted after the session that Mercedes looked extremely strong and that Ferrari currently feels one step behind their performance. Red Bull reached a similar conclusion. Even before Verstappen's crash in qualifying, the team already believed Mercedes had executed the new regulations better than anyone else. But the size of the gap still surprised many people. Nearly 0.8 of a second separated Russell's pole lap from the closest non-Mercedes car. That margin is enormous. And whenever a difference that large appears at the start of a new regulation era, the rest of the grid begins asking very careful questions. Not accusations. Not immediately. But questions. How is the hybrid system deploying energy? How efficient is the energy recovery during braking? How does the power delivery remain so stable throughout the lap? Because in Formula One, even the smallest technical advantage can change everything. And right now, after qualifying at the Australian Grand Prix, one possibility is starting to circulate quietly inside the paddock. What if Mercedes has simply found a way to use the new hybrid regulations more efficiently than everyone else? But the deeper engineers looked into the telemetry after qualifying, the more the conversation inside the paddock intensified. Because the Mercedes advantage did not appear in just one section of the lap. It appeared everywhere. When analysts compared GPS overlays from Russell's pole lap with the rest of the field, they saw something unusual in the acceleration patterns. Normally, every Formula One car shows a very similar rhythm when leaving a corner. The driver applies throttle. The hybrid system deploys electrical energy. The car gains speed quickly for a few seconds. Then the electrical boost begins to fade as the battery drains along the straight. That pattern repeats around the entire lap. But the Mercedes trace looked different. Instead of showing that gradual drop in electrical power, the acceleration curve remained almost perfectly smooth. The car continued building speed much deeper into the straight, almost all the way to the braking zone. For rival engineers, that detail was impossible to ignore. Because under the 2026 regulations, electrical deployment is one of the most tightly controlled areas of the power unit. Teams are limited in how much electrical energy they can deploy during a lap. But the efficiency of how that energy is harvested, stored, and released is where teams can still gain an advantage. And the Mercedes appeared to be operating that system extremely well. Possibly better than anyone expected. Which is why some engineers began asking a very specific question. What if Mercedes has found a way to harvest slightly more electrical energy during braking? Even a small improvement in harvesting efficiency could create a massive difference. More harvested energy means more power available on corner exit. More power means stronger acceleration. And stronger acceleration means lap time. That theory would explain why Russell's lap looked so controlled. The car never appeared to struggle for electrical energy. The deployment seemed perfectly balanced across the entire lap. Every time Russell exited a corner, the Mercedes responded instantly. Smooth power delivery, stable rear traction, and consistent acceleration all the way down the straights. That combination makes a car extremely easy to drive at the limit. And it was visible in Russell's driving. No dramatic corrections. No instability. Just a calm and precise lap that delivered pole position. Andrea Kimi Antonelli showed the same characteristics. The young driver placed the second Mercedes on the front row, confirming that the performance was not just a single exceptional lap. It was the car. And that is exactly why rival teams began sharing their observations with the FIA. Not as accusations, but as technical questions. Because whenever one team appears to have discovered a new advantage, the governing body must ensure everything remains within the regulations. That process is normal in Formula One. It has happened many times in the past. Teams innovate. Rivals analyze the solution. And sometimes the FIA is asked to clarify how the rules should be interpreted. Right now, the Mercedes power unit is at the center of that discussion. Ferrari engineers are studying every acceleration trace they can find. Red Bull is analyzing energy deployment corner by corner. And across the paddock, the same conversation keeps appearing. Has Mercedes simply mastered the new hybrid regulations faster than everyone else? Or have they discovered a clever technical interpretation that the rest of the grid has not yet understood? Because if the answer is the first option, the rest of Formula One may have a serious problem. Improving hybrid efficiency is not something teams can fix overnight. It requires new software strategies, new energy management systems, and sometimes even mechanical adjustments to the power unit itself. Which means if Mercedes truly has a breakthrough in hybrid performance, the advantage could last for several races. Maybe even longer. And that possibility is exactly why the tension inside the paddock is growing so quickly. Because while Mercedes celebrates a dominant front row in Australia, the rest of the grid is already trying to figure out how they did it. But while the debate around the Mercedes power unit was growing inside the paddock, another detail from qualifying made the situation even more explosive. Because this was not just about a fast lap. It was about how dominant that lap actually looked compared to the rest of the field. When the final times appeared on the timing screen, the gap shocked almost everyone watching. George Russell on pole. Andrea Kimi Antonelli in second. Both Mercedes cars on the front row. And behind them, the closest competitor was almost 0.8 of a second slower. In the modern era of Formula One, where the entire grid is often separated by less than 1 second, that kind of advantage is enormous. It immediately changed the tone inside rival garages. Ferrari engineers began reviewing their own telemetry from the session. Red Bull analysts started comparing speed traces from every sector of the track. And the conclusion many teams reached was surprisingly similar. Mercedes had not only produced the fastest car, they had produced the most complete package. The car was stable through corners. It looked extremely balanced under braking. and the power delivery out of slow corners appeared incredibly smooth. Charles Leclerc even admitted after the session that the performance of the Mercedes had surprised Ferrari more than expected. He explained that although the Ferrari showed strong potential, the benchmark in Melbourne was clearly the Mercedes. Red Bull reached a similar conclusion. Even before Max Verstappen's crash during qualifying, the team already believed they would struggle to match Mercedes during the first race weekend of the season. And the results only confirmed that expectation. From inside the Red Bull garage, the picture looked very clear. Mercedes had executed the new regulations extremely well. The car looked stable. The hybrid system appeared efficient. And the drivers had the confidence to push the car to its limit. But that same dominance is exactly what triggered the growing pressure on the FIA. Because whenever one team suddenly appears this far ahead at the start of a new technical era, the rest of the paddock wants answers. They want to understand exactly where that advantage comes from. Sometimes the explanation is simple. A better aerodynamic concept, a lighter chassis, or a driver delivering the perfect lap. But sometimes the answer lies deeper. Inside the power unit. Inside the hybrid systems. Inside the complex algorithms that control how electrical energy is harvested and deployed around the lap. And right now, that is exactly where the spotlight is pointing. Because the acceleration patterns seen in Melbourne suggest that the Mercedes power unit may be operating with incredible efficiency under the new hybrid rules. If that advantage comes purely from engineering excellence, then Mercedes deserves enormous credit. But if the system is exploiting a gray area in the regulations, the FIA may need to clarify the rules very quickly. That is why the governing body is now paying such close attention to the data coming from the Australian Grand Prix. Because the first race of a new regulation cycle often reveals the biggest innovations. Sometimes those innovations become the new standard for the sport. And sometimes they trigger technical investigations that reshape the entire championship. For Mercedes, the situation now sits somewhere between triumph and scrutiny. On one hand, they have delivered an extraordinary performance. Pole position, a dominant front-row lockout, and a car that looks incredibly competitive. On the other hand, that success has placed their power unit directly under the microscope of the entire paddock. And as teams continue analyzing the data from Melbourne, the questions are only getting louder. Because right now, after the first qualifying session of the 2026 season, one possibility is starting to worry rival teams. What if Mercedes has not just built the fastest car? What if they have already mastered the new hybrid era before anyone else even understood it?